Hello everyone and welcome to today's session, Combating Cybersecurity Attacks Amidst a Raging COVID Infodemic. I'm Shilpa Goswami and I'll be your host for the day. We would like to go over a few house rules for our attendees. The session will be in listen only mode and will last for an hour, out of which last 10 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. If you have any questions during the webinar to organizers or our speaker, use the Q&A window. Also, if you face any audio video challenges, please check your internet connection or you may log out and log in again. An important announcement for certificate of attendance. Participants need to attend the complete webinar to qualify for this certificate. Also, should fill in the survey form, which will be sent in the attendees thank you email and answer correctly the 3 multiple choice questions based on the webinar. The certificate of attendance shall be sent to you within the next 5 to 7 working days after the event. Our speaker for today's session, Dr. Ankur Chatterjee. He is an assistant professor of computer science and cybersecurity in the School of Computing and Analytics at Northern Kentucky University. He currently serves as the program coordinator of NKU Bachelor's in Cybersecurity program. He earned his PhD in computer science from the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs and has worked with the NSA, NSF as the program director and PI for multiple Gen Cyber program grant awards since 2017. His research interests include visual privacy, authentication trust, cybersecurity and CS education, privacy enhancing and inclusive machine vision, online healthcare information assurance, trustworthy AI and cybersecurity. He has more than 15 years of work experience in academics and industry. Without any further delay, I would hand over the session to you, Ankur.
Thank you, Shilpa. I would like to start by greeting everyone, all our viewers and audience here with that. So today I'm pleased and very happy to actually present one of my newest research areas of works, as you can see, titled as Combating Cybersecurity Attacks Amidst the Raging COVID Infodemic. I would like to just bring our attention to the word cyber, which is spelled as the PSYBER, and that is actually the main sort of takeaway or sort of twist in this talk, I would say. So I will explain during my presentation how cybersecurity is kind of a little bit distinct from the way the cybersecurity, which is CYBR, the cyber world, we go by with that. So what I'm going to talk about before I start, sort of giving an overview of this research area, I want to point out that obviously, given the time constraints, there is a lot of intricacies and details into this topic, and I do have some notes in there in my slides, but in case you're kind of interested in getting a little bit more out of it in terms of going and reading further, you can obviously at the end of this talk reach out to me, and I'll be happy to share more of the citations and including some of my recent publications in this area. So let's kind of start with understanding, a little bit of the presentation agenda. So I'll be in the first part of the presentation talking about, as I said, the cybersecurity world. I'll be kind of welcoming you and explaining what exactly is cybersecurity. How is it connected to the traditional cybersecurity world that we know? And more importantly, I'll talk about the psychology side of things, which is where this research kind of goes into a little bit more interdisciplinary side, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of the work I've been doing lately. And more importantly, I will try to do a connection of how this is all linked to the COVID pandemic, which has affected all of our worlds. I think that's something you all realize that we have in common now, the post-pandemic with that there. And I'll also kind of talk about some of the things which is important in terms of how, or what I call as the COVID PSA, which is related to the cybersecurity attacks, how they are kind of related to our world here, how they kind of are significant in terms of what needs to be done. And I'll try to sort of analyze the whole thing or sort of give you a summary of the whole vision of what kind of work there is out there and what kind of work which is still to be done. So I'll talk about some of the open directions and scope of future directions of work, whether it's research questions, I'll also, during the talk, give you some examples of the kind of work that has been done or what is going on right now. And I'll kind of end the talk by showing you some of my research artifacts, which I've collected over the time, which has got to do with a data set that I'm building in this particular area of COVID infodemic. And I'll at the end of it, like I said, I hope that we get to the point where we can have some live interactions, and I'll take questions and answers. Before I start the talk, one thing which applies to this particular, webinar, and I love about is a quote from Bruce Schneier, who's actually a very well-known, cybersecurity, professional, especially in the U.S. With that, he's known worldwide. So he mentions amateurs hack systems, whereas professionals hack people. And a lot of the theme of this talk, as we move on, you'll understand more of this realization. Okay, so first and foremost, we'll talk a little bit about what is cybersecurity. So cybersecurity, as I referred to at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned, is essentially talking about the science of securing the mental health, protecting the human mind or the psychological well-being from the psychiatric consequences of cyber attacks. So in very short form or very simplified manner, I can explain it as got to do with how you kind of protect the mental health aspects of victims who have gone through a cyber attack. So someone who has been, for example, a victim of phishing or some sort of a social engineering attack, what kind of goes into the mind and how that can be protected. Cybersecurity kind of falls into that realm. But what is also interesting is it's kind of multi-layered. If you think about, cyber attacks, the kind of cyber attacks which has been going around, and as you see over here, I point out some of the attack vectors. When we talk about the mechanism used by cyber criminals or hackers to exploit or attack people. Now, again, the fact is that you can attack systems, you can, gain authorized access to systems, computers, but at the same time, you can also attack people. And I think what is important here, as I pointed out to Bruce Schneider's earlier quote, is that cybersecurity has got a lot to do with where we're talking about actually the portion where the people are being affected or being attacked with that there. And that could happen directly or indirectly. So if a system is compromised, you have, for example, a lot of the cyber activities or attacks which are going around us almost on a day-to-day basis with that. There's huge statistical numbers to that. You can think about the aftermath of that. What kind of scars do they put in the human mind, to our psychological well-being? That's got a lot to do with this whole field. So it's kind of interdisciplinary. And the one thing which I want to point out is that typically when you define cybersecurity, one thing which stands out with the regular, term cybersecurity, and that's the distinction lies in, is the fact that your attack target in cybersecurity is specifically going to be the mental health or the human mind. And I want to point out that I recently published an article, in 2021, last year, for IEEE Future Directions. So if any of you are interested, that's how I kind of describe and kind of introduce the topic with that, and how I kind of, put that together as an emerging area of research. So again, I'm going to talk a little bit about that further, but I want to point out quickly, as you see here in one of the graphics shown here, is that one term which will come across during this talk is a new term. So, a lot of us have heard about the term of social engineering, and social engineering does go through a fair bit of, human persuasion, or how it kind of exploits the human psyche with that there to get its purpose done, which is attacking the systems. But psychiatric engineering is a new term, and as you probably can see from, the infographic right up there with that, again, that's kind of mentioned in details in my article. That's the new form of cybersecurity attack, as I was saying with that. So especially the cyber side is got to do with the mental aspect. So this is kind of an attack where you're talking about exploiting the perspective of what goes into the human mind in terms of the signs and symptoms, and you're kind of manipulating or sort of orchestrating treatment. Typically what psychiatrists go through with, let's say, victims of cyber attacks, you're kind of trying to throw off or disrupt that whole treatment with that. So it's a very sophisticated sort of form. At the same time, it involves a lot to do with the human psychiatry as well. So I just want to point out this term. Again, during later part of this talk, I'll kind of try to explain and dissect this in more details. But terms to be noted as psychiatric engineering is a new form of attack, which is slowly getting prominence. So before we proceed ahead, let me kind of do a little bit of dissection of how exactly the traditional cybersecurity is related to psychology. So if you think about it, like I was mentioning, if cybersecurity does have a direct and prominent component of attacking people, then it's got to do a lot with psychology. So if you see over here with that, as I was mentioning earlier, that one type of cyber attack, which is something that I've studied quite carefully, is the social engineering. That actually does prey a lot and bank on a lot in terms of manipulating the human psyche, trying to sort of take advantage of your anxiety, in the minds which we have, the fear and typically, things like phishing attacks, which are very prominent with emails, kind of bank or prey on that. Psychology, on the other hand, is the scientific study of the mind and how the human behavior goes. And what is interesting is the cognitive side of psychology involves study of all the internal mental processes here. So I want to quickly bring this point because, once I dive into further into this webinar and talk about some of the aspects as part of, what I'm currently doing research with, this would become more and more apparently clear that, with the cyber security term coming in, the way the world is going is that this research area is getting, more interdisciplinary. We're kind of going into the aspects of psychology. So, for example, currently my work actually involves studying a lot of these parts of psychology. And on that note, let me kind of bring in one of the things that I have been studying, and this is fairly kind of familiar with a lot of people who have been following the whole ideology of social engineering, how that attack goes in, like I was mentioning. So I want to sort of quickly prompt over here with that. There, Cialdini's 6 principles of persuasion, or how it kind of guides in how Cialdini describes, who's a very prominent and well-known, renowned psychologist. He's got a number of publications with this, and I do cite his work with that, but this is kind of interesting. So Cialdini talks about these 6 principles of persuasion by which someone can actually influence the human mind, and that is kind of currently being studied a lot, especially in social engineering. There's lots of different literature around there, but let me quickly point out some of these principles. So all of these, if you see, if it case of a reciprocation where people kind of try to reciprocate feelings. For example, someone is indebted to someone and want to do something for them in return. That's one of those points which is used by, or that's one of those typical psychic principles which is used by attackers in something like a social engineering. And I'll kind of point out that psychiatric engineering, which I just mentioned and introduced, that's the new form of cyber security attack that is kind of focused on this particular area of work. So, if you go around here with a lot of these psyches, the human psychology, like I said, mind, the way it works is that, we try to sort of stick around. We have a tendency to believe or take for granted people that we like, the people that we know. We have almost like this implicit thing to trust people, where the people says with that there, and that actually is a reason of a lot of these forms of attacks, whether it's psychiatric engineering or social engineering. So again, during this talk, I'll kind of trying to connect some of these principles of persuasion, the work that psychologists do with the work that, for example, cybersecurity technical people do. But what is the important point here is that there is a big intersection, and I think the way in the future is actually to have a lot of collaboration across the fields with that there. So again, I'll kind of point out the note that if you want to delve in a little bit more details for the talk, due to the scope of time, you can obviously look up some of these works very much around here. You can find it online resources, but Cialdini's principles is definitely something to know about, especially if you're going to delve into this new field of work of cybersecurity with that there. Okay, so explaining a little bit of psychiatric engineering, the one that I talked about, and social engineering. So if you think about psychiatric engineering, it's probably not quite a technologically orchestrated attack, as I was mentioning, and that's where it's different from social engineering, but both have some commonalities. Now, obviously, psychiatric engineering is a form of attack vector, which is very much kind of trying to manipulate and disrupt psychological diagnosis or treatment. So I'll give an example. If someone who's been a victim of a cybersecurity attack, is going through, let's say, post-traumatic syndromes and so with that, and because of the cyber attack, the person who has no prior history of post-traumatic syndrome, is not actually sort of a patient of, mental trauma, or so can go through the temporary phase. I think we all have had that experience of being first-time victims, and that whether it's that phishing email or so. I can tell you myself, I also have been victim, before I started doing serious research in this field with that and got more knowledgeable, obviously, and smarter. But the first time you fall victim, you probably feel awful, right? And again, looking at the way we all are, we are different personalities and different individuals. We react to that situation differently. And what I'm referring to is those symptoms which you suffer, and maybe that causes a lot of stress, where you go and see a psychiatrist or a doctor, who is probably you kind of trust with that there, and share some of the symptoms. And again, if the person there doesn't know the background, what you're experiencing, you might be treated in a way which you're kind of treated as a regular mental trauma patient with that. So we're talking about a different form altogether where things are going, and that's exactly what the psychiatric engineering is kind of trying to prey upon, is the fact that it's trying to disrupt your psychological analysis, give the sort of impression to a medical expert like a psychiatrist that you actually are maybe a different kind of trauma victim, where you're just probably going through some temporary post stress symptoms from a cybersecurity attack. And again, given the form of cybersecurity attack, different victims again react differently. But that's something which is very important, especially in this age where cyber attacks are so prone, that we have to look after the human mind and ourselves with that. And that's exactly what cybersecurity, like I mentioned, is kind of got to do a lot with. But I want to quickly point out that social engineering does have some similarities with psychiatric engineering. Social engineering definitely sort of bands. Both of them deals with the human psyche. So whereas social engineering is trying to rely heavily on human interaction in its first initial phase, where it's trying to sort of bank on the human vulnerabilities, things like anxiety, fear we have, and ultimately it kind of manipulates you in that way to get you to, share your information or break into your system. That's the idea of social engineering. Phishing would be one of the examples with that, where somebody sends you an email with some sort of a link where you want prize. So again, that's the form of psychological aspect it's kind of preying upon. Psychic engineering is also kind of preying upon the psyche or the psychological composition of us, but it's in a different way. So obviously it does, both of them does deal with the human psychiatry in one form or other, and Cialdini's principles, which I shared in the previous slide, does apply to them. But their end goals are a little bit different. So that's something which is interesting. And again, this is, I think, the new form of way to study. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more about psychiatric engineering and social engineering in the coming days with that. So having said that, let me kind of bring in over here, what exactly is sort of important to the whole principle, and how the COVID pandemic is playing a big role here with that. So before I kind of talk about establishing the relationship with cybersecurity field with the COVID pandemic, I want to point out some important things. As we all know, the COVID pandemic has really been raging around, and I think the whole world has changed. It has its impact already there. But one of the forms of impact which I'm talking about here specifically is the fact that how many of us actually probably have kind of seen more of these COVID scam messages coming up almost on a basis of a daily thing. And how many of us kind of have been misled, whether we talk about in terms of misinformation or disinformation. I'm talking about the phenomenon where you've kind of totally been uncertain with the new thing, COVID emerging, and you've been kind of probably going around online to look up more information and do research on it with that. And, the fact is that what is the information out there where we can trust, what kind of information we can trust. So COVID really has led to a spread of a lot of misinformation, whether it's in the form of, the disease itself, or it's in the form of the vaccines. And that actually has gone to the proportions of such serious nature that the World Health Organization, or WHO actually, which is popularly known as the standard international body, they have referred to this as almost an infodemic challenge. That's where the infodemic comes in with that there. So what is interesting is there's some stats over here, as you probably can see from the slides, is that there's been almost an 85% rise in online healthcare information searches, whether it's to do with COVID, especially this is with the pandemic setting in, where people have been looking over online. Again, with the lockdowns happening, a lot of people who otherwise would have been working, in analog environments have changed to digital. They've been working from home in their laptops or machines, and that's what has led to a significant rise in online, searches with that. So a lot of us actually have been looking at this information, and they've been looking at the point of, having different kind of health anxiety. And what the misinformation or disinformation, as you kind of describe it, does is that it throws off and leads to a lot of these psychological issues. And that's where it's kind of connected to the cybersecurity term, which I was explaining in the previous slides. Another interesting stats over here, when the research I was doing, and I've put in some of my citations at the bottom of the slide with that, is that it's found that, with the COVID pandemic, there's an estimated amount to be about 300 billion scam messages, which has been going around almost per day basis around the world globally. We're talking about a very serious statistic here with that. And if you think from that perspective, this is an absolutely, the COVID infodemic, as I can mention now or refer to, is absolutely a bane. It's been a challenge to society. And that's where my kind of current research comes in. And the way I see it is that now, if we look at from the perspective of psychiatric engineering or social engineering, it is actually, at the end of the day, a form of cybersecurity attack, a specific form where the human mind is kind of involved one way or the other with that. And that's what essentially, the cybersecurity professionals, we probably are now looking, or we have to be more, sort of aware of protecting. And that's exactly where the study or my research is kind of going with. So on that note, let me kind of talk a little bit about my current area of research where I've been working in, and this is what I call as the COVID infodemic-driven cybersecurity attacks, or in short form, COVID PSA. So like I was mentioning, the COVID pandemic obviously has now fueled the creation of a lot of misinformation, fake websites, fake online contents, and a lot of us who are netizens or who are online users, as we call them, online users, are obviously very vulnerable to these attacks with that, and they probably don't have proper guidance with that. And obviously, if you are falling victim to these attacks, you obviously are going to be, experiencing what I was talking about, like what typically victims of cybersecurity attacks or regular cybersecurity attacks experience after falling with that there. And that is where the mental health is kind of attack target with it. And that's why I think more research and more work needs to be done towards sort of combining the technical aspects to the psychological and psychiatric consequences. And that's where there's this fine amalgamation with that there. But what is interesting is there's a lot of literature out there, if you look around with that, which links cybersecurity to mental health with that. But I think there's not probably much work which is kind of looking to look at specifically the COVID-related misinformation, disinformation. And that's where my research comes in, where I'm specifically looking at what I refer to as the COVID misinformation. And some of the things that I would like to cite here is that you can look up, there is actually a psychiatrist from the Bay Area in the USA. His name is Dr. Ryan Louie, who actually is, right now doing a lot of, study in this area of cybersecurity. He's obviously not a technical person, he's a psychiatrist, and he actually has a website called Cybersecurity Clinic, and that's kind of very fascinating to go and see. And again, the fact is that I was talking about earlier that there should be now more interdisciplinary, collaboration with that there. So that's one of the researchers which is out there who's doing some work there. And like I mentioned, I have an article which I published on the cybersecurity, how it's kind of emerging area in this field. So on that note, let me kind of go in and talk more about what exactly is the research that is out there and can actually happen with that. And I'll start with the COVID PSA. So if you think about the COVID PSA and some of these graphics, so the pictures which you see over here kind of shows that, the problem that we are experiencing and referring to is the misinformation, the COVID infodemic problem, like I mentioned with that. And obviously it's a form of cybersecurity attack, whether you look at it from the cyber way or the traditional cybersecurity way with that there. So what I feel, and that's what I've done research in my literature, is that we do need tech intervention, in form of a tool or aid to protect our vulnerable netizens, and so the online users who are kind of going through this information are looking up, do they actually have some appropriate standards or guidance to kind of look them over, or appropriate advice for that matter? Are there certain preventive measures that can be effective against these COVID misinformation or the attack which starts from that? So that's one of the research questions that I've been studying and looking into, and I think it's a relatively new research area. And what I would like to do in the next few slides, I want to talk about some examples of tools and so which has been already done there. So I want to start with the example of NewsGuard. Now, NewsGuard obviously is a very well-known form of utility app. It's available in the form of a web extension which you can download. You might have to pay a small subscription fee if you look it up, but it's been around for a while. Now, I want to mention over here that NewsGuard is not specific to COVID infodemic. It's general, specific to media or social media, information, misinformation, which is kind of spread there. And what it does basically is that it tracks different kind of articles, news articles, and rates its credibility. The one thing I want to point out with the NewsGuard and what my research when I analyzed it is that it has a more of a journalism perspective to it. It does not have necessarily a scientific computing approach that it uses, something like machine learning or AI or data analytics technique, which I think is where we should be going. And that's why it rates website domains from more of a journalistic perspective. And the one thing it is also in terms of its limitations is that it does not necessarily rate individual articles. So for example, today we have different kind of articles coming out on COVID, and especially with the pandemic going on. So NewsGuard basically is going to offer you protection in terms of rating pages, but it is going to be more of a generic perspective. So it could be for a website domain rather than going through the respective articles. So for example, if a website has a number of articles, which some of them might be reliable, trustworthy, some of them not. So if there is information or fake information which is being percolated with some of them, NewsGuard probably wouldn't be able to protect you from that. And again, in general, NewsGuard is not tiered or sort of aligned with COVID misinformation. It's general misinformation, and that's where it's probably not quite up to date with especially the COVID infodemic problem now hitting us hard with that. But if any of you are interested, the NewsGuard URL is given there with that. You can try out this tool. It's kind of an interesting tool, and in case if you're curious, it does use, as this slide kind of gives you a snapshot, these visual indicators as to when you go to a website domain, whether it's clear to go. So the green tick mark would be that it's rated and adheres to standards. Red would be obviously a red flag with that. It also interestingly has some classifications of websites as being satire or humor with that. And obviously, these are part of that utility. I was talking about the web extension that you can download with NewsGuard. But like I mentioned, the main limitations is that it does not use any sophisticated AI techniques. And more importantly, it's not attuned to the COVID infodemic problem that I was mentioning too. On that note, let me move on and talk about a very new form of research work. This is called Co-Verify, and I want to point out that this is one of the first of its kind work, which is done by a bunch of researchers from University of Texas at Austin in the US. And these researchers actually have done very interesting work. So they've created this website, the standalone website, which kind of takes in all these different news feeds about COVID. And I'll in a bit show you a screenshot from the website. If you look up Co-Verify, you will find that. This is kind of a first prototype that they've come up with, and very interesting work. So what they're basically doing is that they're kind of trying to classify these news feed articles based on some machine learning and textual analytic techniques, which is applying. One of the things that the researchers or these researchers have particularly done is that they have actually used some COVID misinformation related data sets, which is out there, which actually contains a lot of different websites, things like, classified fake articles or fake news with that. And they've used that data to feed in to create this standalone website tool with that there. But one of the things in terms of limitations, which can also be thought about as an interesting thing, is that this Co-Verify website actually is kind of banking on human interaction. So it's kind of asking users to rate news items. So it's asking whether you think that article based on the news field is genuine or is it fake with that. So it does take that human polling element into it. But one thing about it, which is probably a limitation the way I see it, is that it's not a self-driven utility. It's a standalone website. So unlike NewsGuard, which I was talking about, it does not have like a web extension or some sort of app to help you with that. It's almost like a standalone website. And in case you're interested, this is how it looks like. There's a snapshot taken from the Co-Verify. And if you can see over here, obviously there are different websites, and you can see the news feeds taken from those websites. For example, you can see the Washington Times. What it's actually doing is that it's collecting these human votes from the users. It's asking user to kind of rate these articles or these website, online contents, whether it's credible or fake. So you can kind of go in there and you can click on the links, the green one, the credible. If you think it's credible, it will, sort of record your input with that. But in the backside, it's kind of using a machine classifier. So the percentage that you're thinking or seeing over here is based on an algorithm it's using based on its machine classification from the data that it's using. Like I mentioned, some of the data sets which is out there, and it's kind of putting that together along with the user votes and coming up with these percentages. So pretty interesting work altogether with that. And of course, you can find out more if you go and read the article. But this is kind of a new area, like I was mentioning with that. So what is important, the challenge which lies ahead with us and prospective, research work potential, which I'm also currently looking at, is that can we actually build a smart knowledge recommender tool to be designed for providing information assurance and advice to these netizens, people who are online, where you're going to a website, can you actually get the genuine, knowledge recommendation, get the advice where you can trust this? So in other words, can we build a tool that can kind of pick these websites with the COVID-related information and can almost certainly genuinely classify them as fact versus fake, as the picture there with that there. I think that's the challenge. That's the research question with us. And how to design such a tool, if you have to make such a comprehensive tool. The ones that I talked about all have their limitations. So obviously that's the challenge which lies for, and that's where my research currently is looking into with that there. So let me kind of talk about going from here into something very interesting. So once I started looking at the previous research question, as I mentioned, the one thing which came across to me, and like I was mentioning, a lot of these tools kind of bank heavily on data sets. So it's kind of a data-driven decisions. And what I kind of found out, and that was kind of the bane or the main problem, is that there was not sort of one single comprehensive holistic data set when it comes to COVID misinformation. And let me point out about some of the existing works here, especially when it comes to COVID info data sets. And I'll then talk a little bit about where my future work is going from here with that. But let me just point out, what you see over here in this slide are examples of some COVID information data sets, which is popularly used by the researchers. It's out there in the literature. The first one, which is one of the first to come out, is called CO-ED. That's a data set which actually basically what it contains is a list of different fake news articles. So it has a bunch of different listed URLs for those articles, and it kind of has a classification tag along with them, whether that particular online article is fake or real. It's got a good collection of about 5,000, 6,000 of these website items, these different online articles, where it has been studied and seen, whether it's fake or fact for that matter. And what they are doing is basically they're asking researchers that you can kind of use and kind of bank on these data sets. And the Co-Verify work I was referring to earlier kind of uses the CO-ED data set. Now, the other two data sets, which are recovery and MM-COVID, more recent works, they're kind of what I call as the multimodal data sets. So what I mean by multimodal here is that it has different mediums of forms of information. So typically, if you think about these data sets, like I was mentioning, they contain a list of URLs, a lot of these online articles, along with their labels or their tags. Most of them are textual information, and that's something in common with a lot of these COVID information data sets that I found, is that they're predominantly relying on textual information. But the multimodal kind of data sets, the MM-COVID being a classic example, the last one listed here with that, is where it's looking beyond textual data. So for example, it's looking at things like images or small, graphical elements which are in those websites. So if you have a website, you have a web article, you can actually start looking beyond just the textual information there, but you can look at things like the infographics, which is in there, things like, the logos, things like images that has been using. So that would actually emerge and lead to a whole new pattern. And that pattern could actually lead to a new research area altogether. That's what I call as beyond textual data. And again, from the general literature analysis which I have done, I've seen that researchers typically use the samples of the above data sets, and they used it predominantly for textual analytics. They're using these text-based tools, whether it's machine learning algorithms or so, to do it. So the future, and that's what I go in next, lies into looking beyond just these textual cues, as I say, or this data. And what I like to talk about is visual cues. So this is where I kind of open up this whole topic about what I call as COVID info visual cues, or in short form, VQs. So like I was mentioning, primary focus for a lot of this research around, again, it's a relatively new area still, you have to understand, is on textual analytics, and it's using the textual cues heavily. But there is probably a very much underutilization when it comes to the research on visual cues, and that's where my current research is looking into. So I want to point out what exactly makes these multimodal data. So if you think about the multimodal data, it's textual cues plus visual cues. You have to look at the entirety of this information in order to build a robust classifier. And that's where I think there is much research lying ahead and needs to be done. So as I mentioned, textual cues plus visual cues would be the way to go about. Now, I want to point out, when I say visual cues, what do I mean? So if you think about it from that perspective, I'm talking about things like graphic contents. I'm talking about images. I'm talking about infographic elements, which is out there, whether it's in websites or in social media posts. I'm talking about logos. I'm talking about, anything in terms of, any graphic contents that is posted there. And, from my research, it suggests that these VQs can be equally viable assets, if not more important than textual cues, to be combined along with textual cues and to build, more robust COVID misinformation detection and classification. So let's kind of move on and look at some sample artifacts, which is going to be interesting. So if you look at this picture, this is artifact number 1, which I've collected. Again, I'm kind of trying to build my own data set, so ground truth data set on VQs with that. So if you look at this, it's an interesting infographic, which again came from a COVID info website. I think the question, which kind of what I'm going through over here, is that, it's interesting to see whether or what kind of information is being presented here. So if you think about it, this is kind of a typical example of a claim image that I found during my research with that. So it's kind of trying to draw an analogy between, what a chef does versus, a different field altogether, which has got to do with the field of vaccines, right? So again, if you think about the analogy, it kind of makes you think and makes a claim or so on, draws in. Now, this sort of information, if you think about it, when it's spread in social media or in the websites with it, obviously this sort of visual cue can kind of form to and give an indication whether it's, actually fake information, is this true or not. So I think that's the big question. And I see that this sort of a visual cue, again, can come into handy to act and sort of, reinforce our current existing data sets. So this is one of the sample artifacts that I've described with that there. It's interesting that, in my research, I'm kind of collecting this data, but I think it's a different question when I'm talking about, when I'm collecting this data and whether it's inaccurate information or not. The one thing I want to point out with this is that with my research, when I find out with that, this is kind of an example of inaccurate information which is being done, but this is an example or a classic case of what I call as a claim image, when it comes to VQs. So let me show you a different category again. I'll show you some of the artifacts that I've collected as part of my preliminary phase of research. So if you see over here, this is taken from CDC, America's Center of Disease and Control and Prevention, very well-known website. And if you look at it, it's a very clear infographic content, right? So it's talking about how hospitalizations have been higher and deaths have been with COVID-19 patients when they have been reported with these underlying conditions. So now, again, it's making a claim, so you can obviously kind of fact check the fact with that there, and this is taken from the CDC website. So obviously, if you look at it very carefully with the research analysis, it suggests that this is actually correct information, it's true information. It's an example of an infographic which can be trusted. So again, these artifacts can actually help build a whole new data set, or for that matter, what I call as a multimodal data set, which adds more to the textual data and actually helps people when they go out their online browsing information to understand, whether this is to be interpreted correctly, again, whether they can trust it. So, but again, one of the more examples of, artifacts when it comes to VQs with that. So let me show you some more of these artifacts. So this is what I call as a classic case of fact-checking image. So this VQ, if you think about it very carefully or look at it, it's kind of quoting a quote from Gaddafi, and it's saying that, obviously what Gaddafi is kind of quoting, that viruses will be created and the people, he's pointing to will be creating the viruses themselves and then selling you the antidotes with that. Thereafter, they'll pretend to find a solution. So this is almost coming into some sort of a disinformation campaign against the fact of COVID vaccines with that there, which might create, again, doubts and anxieties of people's mind. So one of the websites we collected this artifact from was a fact-checking website given in the COVID dataset. They have actually sort of tagged this as a false claim with that there. So if you think about the graphic, interestingly, it does contain the quote, but the fact is that the false logo, which has been used over here, is very strong. So that would give the idea to someone looking, if you just look at it from an image perspective, like a picture with that this is false claim with that there. So there's two aspects I want to point out, which is interesting in terms of research, is that the fact itself, when you're doing the fact checking, you can either go with the textual information, which is embedded within this visual cue, which is this quote by Gaddafi, and it's kind of talking about what he thinks is kind of psychology or what he believes is philosophy with that there. So we can either sort of validate this information or this picture, this infographic, in terms of that quote, or we can look at the tag which has already been assigned to it, which is that false mark, and we can say that this is actually a validated, it's something that can be trusted. So there's two parts to it. And typically with these kind of artifacts, you actually have to first do a fact checking before you can come up with a conclusion, whether it's false, whether it's fake or not with that there. And that is typically where the textual information comes back. So if you see over here, what is interesting is, in my research, I found out that the VQs actually lead you back, where you're going back to the textual data, and that's why it's interrelated, and you have to almost kind of validate those fact checks with that. But anyways, it's kind of interesting in terms of an artifact, which again, I'm collecting and I'm trying to build a data set. So that kind of gives you a little idea of, what would VQs look like if COVID information and way to build a data set with that. Now, what you see over here as an artifact number 4 is interesting. Again, this is taken from my newest preliminary research, which I've done with that. This is typically a logo. It's a CDC logo. Again, like I was saying, it's a very well-known logo of the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, in US with that there, and they have their usual health updates. So this logo is typically used by their website, but the question is, this logo by itself, is it actually trustworthy? Because this sort of a logo can be used by any other false or sort of pretentious website as well. So what the kind of conclusion is, as far as my research analysis goes, that by itself, this logo probably doesn't have as much significance as some of the other artifacts which you see. It probably needs to be added to, along with other information, other kinds of cues, to see entirety and look at it and say if the website which contains this logo is actually trustworthy, if it's fake or it's real with that there. So, but this is interestingly an artifact, and I think that a lot of the websites use these kind of logos. And again, I've been trying to do a classification of these different VQs, and that's what you're kind of seeing over here with that. So on that note, let me move on to a very interesting 5th kind of artifact or category of COVID information VQs that I've kind of come across. And this is kind of the newest vein. So this has got to do with ad content. So if you think about websites, any website, you see these ads which come up. Now, there are some researchers who have been doing some work, and I want to acknowledge that there is actually a company called AdVerify, which is run by some researchers, some AI researchers who are actually originally from Israel. They have come up with some very interesting research, which I was reading in my literature research with this particular area analysis. And they have found that there is actually a pattern which is emerging with these COVID, misinformation websites, whether it's misinformation or disinformation. There are some of these ads. For example, if you look at this picture, with that there, or if you look at the article, which is a snapshot is taken from, and look at the top side, there's actually an ad of this bobcat, which is appearing here. And what they have found is that there is a number of these COVID, disinformation websites that they have come across, which has this repetitive usage of this ad content from the bobcat company. Now, what they're trying to research, and the research question here, which is very interesting, is that, is there a pattern here, from the ad contents which are being used here, which is a form of, visual cue as well? Can we kind of conclude or classify that if we see this as a common pattern emerging with the disinformation websites, maybe this is also an article or online site which is trying to use disinformation, use that, against us with that. So that's another interesting area of work or angle that can be looked into. But what I found out is this is another form of visual cue. So kind of overall, it's kind of interesting the way things are emerging in this area. So I want to kind of point out where sort of the world is going from here in terms of future directions of work. So I can tell you clearly that there is necessary and there's more need, which necessitates this, is that given COVID infodemic, as I mentioned, is such a serious challenge and problem to the society, I think there is more robust and comprehensive data sets that need to be built. What I've kind of trying to do is take a first step, honestly, in this direction with what you saw with the VQs, which are collected of the visual cues. But I think there's plenty of more work needs to be done. And more importantly, I want to point out that by itself, only textual data or visual data or visual cues are not going to be able to solve this problem. I think there is more need to kind of accumulate them together and create multiple layers and multiple dimensions of data. That's what my initial research has suggested. So again, what is interesting is that this sort of data accumulation, and as you can understand, the practicality of this problem is that you can either collect these manually, which is an enormous amount of work, or you can kind of go in and scrape the web. So currently, I've got my own research team consisting of my students, where we're trying to create these web crawlers, these Python scripts that we rewrite with that. They're technically what they're supposed to do is to go in and kind of scrape the different websites and kind of retrieve or extract anything which is images from there to collect that. But the question is whether that approach is sustainable. That's what I'm currently looking into exploring with that there. But this would definitely be, from a practical perspective, an enormous problem with that there, or kind of a lot of the work with that. But it's clear that there would have to be visual cues which would add more to the textual information to kind of reinforce that tool if we have to do it. Now, I would like to point out, like I said, and I mentioned again, I touched almost probably the skin of the surface, and there's just showed you a few of these data sets, namely 3, but there's a lot of these COVID misinformation data sets which currently researchers are coming up with and putting up. In our academic circle, there's typically these data sets which are open up publicly after that with that, and they're doing some really good work. But I think there's more work which needs to be done to enhance some of these data sets, and that's what I'm currently looking to do right now. Is that, for example, the COED dataset can actually go in there, which basically, like I was mentioning, contains a list of URLs as well as online articles. It leads to with that and actually tags it, labels it, whether it's fake or fact with that there. So can we actually enhance these datasets using the approach that I was suggesting, which is adding the visual cues? So that's another angle of work that I'm looking into, apart from, in addition to building our own ground truth dataset from scratch, consisting of these visual cues or artifacts. Can I actually update or enhance these current existing misinformation data sets? And what is more important to that, I think there needs to be more classification categories of the information that needs to be better organized in terms of its different cues, visual cues and textual cues, and that's an important aspect of this work moving forward. And one of the research questions which is important, and I put it listed there, is that how do we go about developing this sort of explicitly multimodal, holistic COVID information data set? Are there certain ways, some strategies that we can do? So that's where I've been kind of looking into a lot of existing data sets, people who have built in different disciplines, what kind of strategies, whether it's optimal, they have kind of taken up. But one thing is for sure is that, the textual and the visual cues is the way to go about. And again, if you think about it, there's possibility to add extra layers or dimension to it. The one thing I have not mentioned here, and that's probably a scope of work or a direction of work also here, is that is there something that the history of a website, how the website has evolved from the very first instance it's being published, is that statistical history of the website, in terms of, the kind of information and the kind of tags it has got. So it's almost like, the rating or reputation marking that a website gets from, different people. Does that sort of reputation category can also contribute to a different dimension to this work? So I'll tell you that's a very kind of new area with that there, and we've just started looking into it. My team is kind of currently doing research with that, but I think beyond just the textual and visual cues, there needs to be more questions asked before we can kind of confidently and more accurately come up with a classifier to kind of tag or predict whether a website is fact or fake. We have to also take into consideration the statistical history of the website, and that's a whole new angle that we're looking into. But I kind of have summed over here some of the potential directions, I think, which we all need to work with, especially the research community and society. But I think these are all interesting problems, and at the same time, as I was mentioning, I think I was hopefully able to make it clear that it's a difficult problem to solve with that there. And so I think on that note, I would kind of like to sort of end my portion of the talk over here and maybe get into some live question and answers here with that there. I would like to just mention over here, like I said, if any of you are kind of interested to more look at some of the articles, again, I know with the time constraint that I've mentioned to point it out, you can obviously email me. That's my email right there with that there. I think the organizer hostess of this webinar will also have my contact available with that there, so you can reach out to me, and I would love to interact and have more questions and answers as to if I have some new ideas with this there. So on that note, I think I will end it over here. So Shilpa, do you want to start the live question answer session now?
Yes. Thank you very much for an informative session, and our attendees share the same sentiments. If you are interested to learn more about our program, do let us know in the poll that's going to be conducted now. Let us know your preferred mode of training and we will reach out to you. So, Dr. Ankur, shall we start the Q&A?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Our first question is by Ayush Das. What would you call cyberbullying?
So good question, Ayush. First of all, thanks for listening to this and coming to your question. So I think, in terms of cyberbullying, and as I'm mentioning at the beginning of the talk, a lot of these different forms of cyber attacks, the traditional forms, which we are aware with, that kind of can be related, if you think about it, to a whole kind of human psyche with that. So if you think about cyberbullying, if you think about the intent of it is to actually dominate the individual. So if you think about dominating another individual where you're trying to bully someone, and that's done in the cyber world, at the end of the day, you're trying to take control. You're trying to kind of influence the other person, whether you're trying to do it by hook or crook, as they say, with different forms with that. So I would say it falls into a very specific, that sort of transitional category of cyber security with that. But let me just point out, I think the point I was trying to make, that this is a form of cybersecurity attack, I would say. But what is important is where cybersecurity, as I was mentioning, lies in. The fact is to do with the human mind. If somebody is being a victim of cyberbullying, what or how or the aftermath happens to it, that's where probably cybersecurity has a more permanent role to play with that. But yeah, calling that, I would say it's a form of cybersecurity attack as well, specialized kind probably, because if you think about it, what is the intent of the bullying person here who's doing the cyberbullying, calling out, is to actually kind of gain dominance over the other regional, and obviously can't do mental disintegration if you think about from that perspective. So yeah, it can be looked at from that perspective as a cybersecurity attack. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much for answering that question. Our next question is from Subendu Barua. What about health data breach and built black business with medical data of patients on new age data, science, and AI and ML?
Okay, first, thanks to Shubhendu for that question, and thanks for listening with that. So it's an interesting point, Shubhendu, you make here with that. So I can tell you that health industry specifically has seen a lot of different breaches. In fact, one of my other research areas, which is not quite this topic, obviously this is on COVID infodemic, I've looked into online healthcare information specifically in terms of the data there with that. But I would say that the problem specifically I'm talking about is with COVID infodemic. Like I said, there's a lot of different health industry breaches which is happening every day. And if your question is specifically in terms of how we look at that, where health information breaches, if you think about it from categorizing it in the perspective or context of cybersecurity, as I was explaining during my talk, is also a form of cybersecurity attack like any other form with that. So it would obviously have its impact and aftermath, right? like any other cybersecurity bit thing, it would, people who have gone through these breaches or cyber attacks, they've gone through their mental disintegration process, one from the other. It might be mild, might be severe with that there, and that's where psychiatrists come in. So I would say that any cybersecurity attack, not just the health information breaches, would kind of fall into that category with that, because it does have the aftermath, that post victim or who is fall victim, the post attack symptoms or components with that. But in terms of what you said as the AI and ML, so I think AI and ML typically, which stands for artificial intelligence and machine learning, has a big role to play here. There's no question, and you probably saw, when I mentioned in my slides during the whole new research area, which is emerging, is how we can use AI more sophisticatedly to form or come up with tech interventions to help people, netizens namely, to understand which is, information, misinformation, real information, and so fact or fake, as I was talking about. So it has definitely a role to play. So I think, coming to your question, I would say that health information breaches would fall into cybersecurity attacks. So it would obviously have a link to the cyber side of things, the mental side of things. Maybe not directly, but indirectly with that there. And AI, ML, the way I see it, will have to play a role. I think that is very clear from what I mentioned, talking about the directions where, my research is going, as well as a lot of other, fellow researchers are working with that. They're applying a lot of these machine learning, data analytics algorithms to do it. So yeah, that's got a big role to that. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you so much for answering that question. Next question is by Rodney. He's asking, what are some of the procedures taken during data migration to prevent any cyber attacks? And what are the best practices when dealing with a network attack?
Okay. Rodney, first of all, thanks for your question and listening with that. Before I kind of take your question, I would like to mention that, I'm not quite an expert when it comes to, data migration with that there. I think, I work with a lot of different data scientists who kind of been doing research with me, including this project with that. So I'll kind of take your question from, the whole initial value of it and just share my thoughts. But again, I would just warn you that it's not someone who is an expert in that field with that there, especially when it comes to network security. I think I'm not quite that kind of guy with that there. I probably do more interdisciplinary research, as this suggested with that. So this might be a limited way of answering your question. So I would suggest that just take it with a pinch of salt with that. So what, in terms of when you do data migration, what sort of, safe practice or procedures you should do with that there? So I would recommend, from what my understanding is, that there's different kinds of data sanitization techniques. In fact, when you're doing data migration with that there, one of the things obviously you have to be careful about is to protect yourself, is that you have to make sure the system is secure with that there. So again, I'm not quite your traditional, data-driven cybersecurity researcher. What I talked about in this talk is probably more into the interdisciplinary side of things with that there. So I probably won't be, commenting on that, but obviously you will have to make the system secure with that there. Obviously, after doing the whole aspect of data migration, I would recommend doing data sanitization, which is very important with that there. One of the areas I work with, especially with migration, and since you worked or sort of mentioned the idea of data migration, is that I work in the area of privacy. So obviously, there has to be protocols, especially if you're doing this data migration as part of a company with that. What I would be interested to see is that whether the protocols are being followed, especially with data privacy, how you're kind of handling the data, migrating with that there. Are you kind of meeting those standards with that? Are you kind of doing that in terms of the procedures with that? So I would kind of point out to data privacy protocols with that. There is a number of different standards that can be taken with that there. So like I said, that's probably not be a perfect answer to your question, but that I'm not an expert with that there. Now, the second part of the question you said about network attacks with that there. Well, obviously, there's different tools to kind of protect that from there. But the normal things I would say is that, if you have an IDS for that matter, which is typically intrusion detection systems with that there, network attacks again coming from different forms with that there. That's one of the standard practices to do with that there. I would definitely recommend using some of those tools, professional tools out there with that to secure. The one thing I can give an overall comment, like just in general with that, is that a lot of these companies, and again, I'm not quite in the industry, I'm more of an academic researcher, but I understand that even in academia, when we are doing some of these things, is that we try to create our own sort of, isolated black boxes where we carry out these things. So I think something like that of an environment, whether it's a virtual sandbox or a DMZ, which is typically the term we use, demilitarized zone. That sort of a zone or perimeter needs to be set up when you're doing that. And I've seen that it's not foolproof, but it probably does a better job in terms of preventing you from those network security attacks. But again, like I mentioned with that, this is kind of interesting question, but it's quite not in my area with that there. So I hopefully I've been able to address some parts of it. Thank you.
Thank you for answering that question. Next question is by Gary Pfeiffer. Who determines what is true or false if something is judged as false and then in the future it is determined as true? How will they show the new validity judgment?
Okay. Gary, thanks for the question. I think that's a very interesting and something which I probably can relate to with that. In fact, what you have made the note that, the judgment or kind of who determines, that's where I was telling during the talk as well with that there, and maybe I want to touch this explicitly a little bit more, is that this is kind of a hard problem to solve. And I'll tell you that the closest I've come with that there, and I believe the way it has to be dealt with, is that we have to come with a ground truth system. Now, I'll tell you why I use the term ground truth, is that, and that's where I come up with the whole policy of sort of strategy of using visual cues or VQs, which I talked about, is that if I think about the area of work, so I've worked in obviously, computer vision, and I've obviously worked a lot with images, with the analytics, with that. It's kind of very much comes down to the bottom line when it comes to images to ground truth. Okay, an image can clearly show what is the ground truth versus what is the manipulated image. So I think something similar analogy-wise needs to be drawn and done with that. It's very hard, and especially what I've found with the existing work in literature with these tools, like I was mentioning, NewsGuard, the way they are kind of rating, you can only obviously say that I'm rating this, but you're not actually kind of passing a judgment. So I think a lot of these tools, existing works, make it very categorically clear that they're not trying to pass a judgment with that. And that's where I think there's not been enough exploration with that there. But if you ask me the way to go about, so the one thing would be that this sort of a judgment is not what the current tools are trying to do. They're trying to come up with an approximate percentage. And it's like with anything with AI or machine learning with that, you're just trying to make predictions. And that's what typically tech researchers like us who are using AI can do. We can predict, okay, this is how we estimate how close it can be. If you see some of the percentage figures, which has been done by the website, like I said, the CoVerify, which has been done by the University of Texas Austin researchers with that, it's just a percentage approximation as to what are the chances, probability, and that too through human interaction. They're kind of taking human poll, is that this is fact or fake. So I think foolproof 100%, guarantee or sort of that is hard to do. But just coming back to the question, I don't think necessarily, the judgment would be the way that I've seen the tech researchers trying to solve this problem with that. But I would say who does that? Well, it's difficult. If you ask me, somebody has got to build the ground truth, right? Like I was mentioning, to give you an example, analogy, like in images, it's beyond any sort of doubt or precision. If we have the ground truth image, this is the original image, and this is what the manipulated image looks like. So if we can boil it down to that point, and that's what my hope is, which I'm trying to do with the visual cues, is that is ground truth with that, then it becomes a lot difficult. But if you look at the complexity of the problem, it is very difficult. It is a very difficult thing to do. So I would sort of rephrase and say that, we're not trying to pass the judgment with that there. It's kind of what has been given with that there. And Shilpa, could you repeat the second part of his question? I know he was talking about who decides on that. What was the second part of the question?
Yeah, it's like, how will they show the new validity judgment?
Okay, yeah, thanks for kind of reading with that. So from what I understand and where the research has been going here with that, is that there is every possibility, for that matter, that things change, and the way the websites are, they have dynamic contents, right? So one thing which has been already validated or sort of rated as being, let's say, false. Now, the way to obviously correct it, if the validity judgment change variation. So a simple example would be, and I'm thinking probably you're hinting towards that, is if a website corrects that or fact checks that to come up with and changes the tag. So like I was talking about these fact checking images you saw in the visual cue, like for example, an image or infographic which has been termed as false. And if that turns out to be otherwise, it's turned as true, I think that information, and that's where probably the AI and machine learning or the pattern recognition, since we're talking about visual cues, I think that's where I think the pattern recognition expertise comes into, where you can deal with image and do analytics of images versus textual analytics. You can kind of change those pattern recognitions. Obviously, the fact is that the validation changes, you have to update the website, or for example, the data sets, rather, what I'm trying to make the point over here. Obviously, the websites would have to update that as well with that, but you can update the data sets rather, I would say, the repositories. They'll have to make sync. So there's a lot of syncing which has to happen. And this always has to happen, obviously, in real time. That's where it makes it a very hard problem. You have so many different data sets. You have to make sure all of these get updated with that information about its changes. So you will have to obviously sync that. And that's only, obviously you'll be getting the right classifier results when it comes to prediction, whether you're trying to predict a side fact or fake with that there. So that's how I would proceed with that. But again, like I said, this is relatively a new area. So obviously a lot of things are being explored and solved this way. But I think you make a fair point with that there. And I would just like to also kind of make a point over here, which is interesting. There's a difference between, what is fact or fake versus something credible versus not credible. That's the fine lines also. So when I talk about the ground truth, I was obviously talking about the pure truth, nothing but the truth with that there. So that would be ideally something that would be the perfect world, but it's very hard to achieve. So it's a difficult problem, nevertheless. So I hope I was able to address that question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you again to our wonderful speaker, Dr. Ankur, for answering those questions and for the great presentation and the knowledge shared with our global audiences. It was a pleasure to have you with us, and we are looking for more and more sessions with you. Before we conclude the webinar, Dr. Ankur, would you like to give a message to our audiences?
I probably, like I said, don't want to preach too much, but it's the one friendly advice I have with that there is that be very careful there. Like I was mentioning, especially, obviously you would see it or hear this from all general traditional cybersecurity professionals, is that be careful, beware of, attacks, whether it's phishing attacks, social engineering. But the one message I would like to say, and since because I'm focusing on cybersecurity, which has got to do with the human mind, mental health, is that please watch over your mental health. I think that's kind of the bane of a lot of different incidents, which we're seeing with the society turning violent. I can tell you in the US, this has been a bane for long. So you have to watch out for your mental health. So in other words, the cyber, spelled with PSYBR, that's the motto. Let's talk with that. Watch over yourself. Look after your cybersecurity, your mental health. Just make sure that you stay safe, stay calm with that there, and look after yourself. Even if, irrespective whether you fall victim to a cybersecurity attack, just take it easy, stay calm with that there, and look after yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ankur, for the message to our audiences. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining the webinar. You may now disconnect your lines. Thank you so much, Dr. Ankur.
Thank you, Shilpa. Pleasure. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.